Hello, everyone. My name is Louise Atlantang, and I want to give you a little bit of a historical context into what we're seeing right now happening in Canada, especially in terms of economics. Okay, so my family line goes back to very old families of Europe. Okay, Habsburg line relates to my family as it does to many people who existed in Canada before Canada was a thing. Okay, Habsburg intermarried with First Nations communities and with cultures all around the world to build nations and to form economic alliances. That's not anything new, that's historical fact. Now, the Queen's line connects to the Habsburg by way of Queen Isabella and the connections to King Willem. And I just want to show you what happened to the monarchy that allowed corporate aristocrats to overwhelm the governance systems, be they democratic or be they socialist or be they communist, it doesn't matter. This is how business takes over things, okay? So the historical context actually begins with a group called the Order of the Golden Fleece. This existed at the time of King Charles, and what it was there was a difficulty with the Habsburg family in gathering taxes because their nationhood grew too big to actually collect the taxes reasonably. They had a vast network of areas to collect the taxes from, and they were growing in debt because the bigger you are, the harder it is to pay for everybody and support that system and keep those alliances open. Meanwhile, there was a group that formed called the Order of the Golden Fleece, and what they were aristocratic business people who had networks among themselves, basically to leverage each other. And they did tournaments and they did charity type dinners, they did causes. Back in the day, the kind of tournaments they had were literally the jousting, things like that, and they made quite a lot of money. Now, through their networking companies, they grew to have more money than the monarchy, and the monarchy started relying on them a lot for funding of various activities. Now, back in the day of Charles V and Maximilian and all those guys, the system of governance was formed by three entities. Okay, you had the crown and the citizenry, you had the church, and then you had the aristocratic rich. And the problem was the aristocratic rich had enough money to bribe either the church or the monarchy in order to get their will done. Okay, so what happened is they lobbied for things like tax evasion. The aristocratic rich never had to pay taxes because they were in with the in club, you see. They were enshrined in that. And even in Canada, we don't see any of these people bound to inheritance tax. There's no inheritance tax in Canada for the rich, none. And so they kept themselves in power and they used the money to bribe. And one of the first big examples of the bribery was with Maximilian I. They used Maximilian to basically oust the monarchy in the Netherlands. Okay? And that was a big boo-boo because you shouldn't be doing that kind of stuff. But that they started orchestrating the power of money. Now, the economic system used to be Roman Catholic, which meant that you could not be a monarch and have usury. Usury means to charge interest on people. You had no control of the funds associated with your own nation as a monarch. Okay? So this is where things get messy because that rule also applied to the Pope. Okay? So you have the Vatican system, and it's illegal under the Roman Catholic law to have usury. So what did they do? They hired a person to manage the money. And in regards to the Vatican, that family was Rothschild who managed their money. And it's the same family who also managed the money of King Willem. Okay, William of Orange there. That was Rothschild there too. And then by the time you get to Queen Elizabeth, you have the City of London acting as the Treasury for the Queen, and they're run by Rothschild. And so you have the Habsburgs being run by the Rothschilds, you have the Queen being run by the Rothschilds, you have the Vatican being run by the Rothschilds. So you start to see a little bit of a pattern of conflict of interest among the Treasury. Okay? So, when it came to the United States history and how that all factors into Canada, this is what happened. Okay? Canada had bloodline families to the Habsburg line that helped to create the nationhood. It funded the early days of Acadia, and it also funded all the way down to South America. The Spanish married in all around the world. They were all part of that Habsburg line back in the day. And you see it in the Philippines, you see it in Mexico, you see it all over these lines, okay? But they're like a hereditary chief line, if you will, you know? They are the people who were of the blood to seal the deal, to help fund the community, but from the people's perspective, not from a top-down perspective. It had more of a localized way of prioritizing how to spend the funds, right? As opposed to having what we have today, which is basically the oligarchy telling everybody what to do. We have, when they did the deportation of the Acadians, it started in Acadia and it went all the way to Standing Rock. It annihilated these families. From that point on, the communications with Europe were destroyed between the original families in Europe. It was a mess. They scattered us like seeds. There was massive grabbing and tearing apart of families and the shipping of them all the way to Haiti and to Falkland Islands and to Europe. The Acadian thing wasn't just between Acadia and Louisiana. It was a global deportation, and it was massively funded, but by whom? That's where the interesting question comes. It was actually the Treasury, and they worked out of the city of London, and it was funded also with the Dutch, who had the fleets. Now, the Dutch made their money by way of spice trades. They were very lucrative in that. And what they did was they did kind of what appeared to be fair prices, right? You go into a poor nation, you buy it at the poor man's price, then they brought it to Europe and sold it for dollars, right? And that's how they made their vast wealth, the whole spice trade, mainly from Indonesia and those areas. And then from there, they started to have trade in regards to slavery, okay? So slavery was existing in North America, and it existed in Africa. It existed with the indigenous people. Indigenous people had a system of slavery where if you were at war and you conquered somebody, or somebody did something wrong in your community, they were made in debt of the family they wronged, okay? So say, for example, a guy rapes your kid, okay? Indigenous people would make that guy an indentured servant to that family because they understood that rape was a power struggle. And it was the family and the girl who was raped who had the say as to whether or not that man lives or dies, whether or not he stays and works for her family, or whether or not he's banished, okay? Those were power constructs back in the day. But what happened with the slave trade was that the Dutch went to these areas of Africa and all over, and they took people for the sake of literally removing them completely out of the cultural context into a system of real, just economic commodity. They commodified human beings to such an extent that it was just madness, okay? So you have areas of Africa where it was the chiefs selling the people who they deemed slaves. And these people were brought in the boats from the Dutch to places like Haiti to make the sugar, sugar was the main thing that drove it, but there was a lot of other crops as well. The average lifespan of a slave back under the Dutch rule was 23 years old, and then they would die because they worked these people to death. There was no regard for the humanity whatsoever. And the French were of the trade of these things because they managed boats in North America as well. Acadians had boats that went from Acadia all the way down to South America and back, and then they went to Europe because the currents go to and from Europe that way. So Acadia had a lot of money in the trade back in the day. They were a port that could do that. Part of the reason why they had so much trade along Acadia was because the cod had vitamin C. It allowed people to cross the sea without getting scurvy. Okay, you follow the fish to and from Europe. That's how they did it. But the thing is, when the French started to integrate with the black communities, they formed families. They had kids. They had plantation, but then the children would inherit the plantation. It became more of a family operation than it was a slavery operation. But as such, what happened was the prosperity of the black people came up. They started to have their own children. They started to have their own communities. And it was leveraging, in a sense, of a social equity that did not exist under the Dutch system. The Dutch took that as a threat, and they went to war against France because of that. There were massive war because we were killing their slave trade. And so what happened was, after we had lost the war, we had lost Acadia to the British. We were considered as British subject. But the Treasury abuses were really horrible, because we had treaties of Utrecht where the Queen Anne and King George basically stated that we could live as British subjects and retain our Roman Catholic faith. And she had to do that because we were of her kin. She couldn't take the nationhood away, and it would have been illegal, right? But the problem is, there were acts done that were Treasury funded that were illegal, violated the rulings of the Treaty of Utrecht and Queen Anne and King George. And it was orchestrated by the City of London scheme that funded all that mess. Okay, so we have the Treasury overruling international law in allowing these conflict of interest wars to take place. So they eradicated the Acadians and all of the people to Standing Rock. And then it was a precursor to the United States War of Independence, the Civil War. They were all part of that. Okay, so yeah, it's quite a mired history. One could reasonably state that the foundation of America and Canada itself was illegal. It was an illegal act. There was no notice to beneficiaries that any of this was going to take place. It violated international law right from the get-go. The Queen Elizabeth has already apologized for the illegality of the deportation of the Acadians. That should say something there. Okay? So Canada has not owned the history. They've buried it. There are secret archives of the church that have not been opened. There are secret archives of Canada that have not been opened, and those archives are massive. In the States, you would have these archives released after 60 years' time. In Canada, they never did. In fact, if you were to stack the documentation in Canada's secret archives, it would be taller than the CN Tower. And that's not a reasonable way for us to proceed, because the concept is, if you're going to develop a community or a nationhood or advance a responsible economic system, you have to be knowledgeable. You have to do your work. You have to have fiscal and judicial prudence. That's something that Canada really, really lacks right there. We've had the track record of having our taxes whittled down to facilitate tax evasion. And actually, one of the largest of the tax evaders in Canada is Irving, and they basically modeled the totality of the money laundering to and from Barbados and Bermuda and all those places. The concept of offshore banking is a Canadian creation that has been here for generations. They've been evading taxes for a very long time, and it's time we hold them accountable, because we can't afford to keep subsidizing everything they want to do. If you look back at the crimes of Grassy Narrows, you'll see that the person who actually allowed for the dumping of those the printing mercury. The mercury was associated with a logging and print company. Okay, the dumping of that was part of the aristocratic elite in Canada. They were actually connected to Jersey Shore companies, and it's all rooted to the nepotism. It's all rooted to the oligarchy of Canada, if you will. If you really want to see the funding behind things like Enbridge Line 9 and TransCanada's pipelines and such, again, you have to go back to the basics of who's behind it economically, and oftentimes it's Irving, and CP Rail has their little perk with sending oil by rail and all this stuff. These are old families, and they've been in the game since Canada began. Ever since the deportation kicked us off the land, the elite of the City of London schemes, they all kind of settled into the area of Nova Scotia. And you'll see their names in the graveyards. Irving, Pattison, Black, Harper, Ford, Nichols, Reuters, Bell, Rogers. Okay, you're starting to see the trend now, right? They own the media. They own the message. They own the history books. Conrad Black wrote an entire history of Canada, and he negated Indigenous cultures. Okay? They were racist from the get-go. They're still racist to this day. It is mired by double standards in regards to the treatment of humanity between how Canada relates to a Canadian baby versus a baby born on a reservation. And with that came a system of human trafficking, literally stealing the babies from the First Nations economic construct into the Canadian society. And they did that by way of residential school. They did that by way of the welfare system. They did that by way of forced poverty. Like my parents, for example, were Acadian. They never called themselves Canadian. Even to this day, they don't consider themselves as Canadian. They are Acadian. And what that is we were the Mi'kmaq people in the sense of the original concept of the Métis Mi'kmaq connection. Okay, so when the Habsburg and the Mi'kmaq intermarried with the line of Membertou, the byproduct of that were Acadian people. Okay, the Acadian and Mi'kmaq families are interwoven. This is the reason why we had neutrality with the Mi'kmaq for generations. We had blood consanguinity, and it was illegal for anyone to set us at war with our own kin. Okay, that shouldn't be a secret today. Most Canadians don't even know what an Acadian is. Okay, but what happened was somewhere along the line, the term Acadian was assimilated by Canada, and I don't know how or when that happened. I'm actually a person stuck in that, where I have been trafficked from my culture as an Acadian person of Indigenous ancestry into the Canadian system, and I don't know how or when that happened. But the concept is we need to move forward today, okay? We're dealing with 2020. We're dealing with the idea that all lives are worthy. Okay, all lives should have access to education, should have access to healthcare, should have access to social supports and banking. I mean, this isn't radical stuff we're asking for here. You know, we have people like Peter MacKay saying that those who are protesting Wet'suwet'en are thugs, and what do you call? We're all paid for by foreign funds. That's absolutely ridiculous. People are all interconnected from one end of Canada to the other, to the stories that predated Canada, because we have been on these lands as Indigenous people for over 25,000 years, and we've been here as settlers for 400, 500 years. Everybody has a connection somehow. But the Canadian aristocratic elite want to always create a false line of us and them. They create their line, calling themselves the entitled, reasonable people, and everybody who has a link to the Indigenous culture are thugs and funded by foreign entity. It makes no sense to continue these lies, to continue this authoritarian, racist, fascist mindset in Canada. It's been fascism since 150 years. And it's not a wonder why. Because the crown was German. Okay, they always were. And it wasn't the crown to blame even. It wasn't even the Germans to blame. What's to blame is the construct of the wars were based on the one who stood to profit from both sides. Okay? We have to hold the Treasuries accountable to the violation of international law, to the violation of human rights, to the fostering of social discord, to the disruption it has caused to governance internationally. Okay? We have seen the aristocratic corporations destroy monarchies, destroy democracies, destroy even socialist system. And how long are we going to live allowing them to continue their path? How long are we going to allow them to go on without any measure of accountability? Okay? If we want a sustainable economy, if we want a healthy environment, if we want to foster peace, we have to invest that way. We have to invest in helping one another. We have to invest in supporting one another. We have to stop the culture of divisive language and blame and move on as a society collaboratively together. But if the Treasury separates us, they have too much power. They have too much power. And it's time for this nonsense to stop. Money is not to dictate slavery to all nations of the world. It was a tool. It was an IOU from one human to another. Okay? Companies are not human. And we need to restore the logic of that again. And we need to restore human dignity. And we need to hold those who caused the war responsible. Don't look at the crowns for that. Don't look at the people for that. They didn't have the say. The real crime was the fraud of the money management. Okay? So let us restructure tax laws in a fair and equitable way that we can stop the nepotism, that we can have inheritance tax, that we can stop the CEOs from acting as banks, stop paying them in shares, pay them in cash and tax them like normal people. Okay? Stop allowing Canada to hold the money of First Nations people for all the oil and gas royalties. Everything that is held for First Nations people as a royalty is not taxed. So let's change that structure, okay? Let's hold these corporations accountable to taxes like anybody else and see what happens, okay? Thank you very much. I appreciate that you're watching, and I wish you well. Bye-bye.